Reading the Times for Thursday, March 5th, 2020. Bloomberg endorses Biden as Sanders laments turnout of young voters. According to a person briefed on his deliberations, Mr. Bloomberg reached the decision to withdraw from the race on Wednesday morning after meeting with his inner circle of advisors at the Upper East Side townhouse, that is the headquarters of his political and philanthropic empire, several miles away from the Times Square campaign office, where just in a few months he assembled an enormous team of aides in a late-starting bid for the presidency. While Mr. Bloomberg's departure from the race was meant to help unite the moderate wing of the Democratic Party behind Mr. Biden, it also has a potential to enrage supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders, who have long regarded Mr. Bloomberg as a malignant force of the 2020 campaign. Mr. Bloomberg's endorsement of Mr. Biden is unsurprising in most respects. The two moderates have enjoyed a cordial relationship over the years. And when Mr. Bloomberg initially passed on a presidential campaign last year, his advisor said it was because he had judged Mr. Biden as too strong for Mr. Bloomberg to overcome. Coronavirus testing offered with just a doctor's approval, CDC says. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention said on Wednesday broadened the guidelines for coronavirus testing, allowing anyone who has symptoms like a fever, a cough, or difficulty breathing to receive a test if a doctor agrees. Previous guidelines required a patient to have symptoms of respiratory illness, as well as a clear route of exposure, such as recent travel to China or a number of other affected countries, contact with a known coronavirus patient, or hospitalization with a severe and unexplained respiratory illness. The changes greatly expand the pool of patients who may qualify for diagnostic testing, even though testing capacity is limited. When can we go to school? Nearly 300 million children are missing class. There's always saying, when can we go out to play? When can we go to school? Said Miss Gao, 48. Similar dislocations and disruptions have taken hold worldwide as the coronavirus has forced at least 9 countries, as well as countless provinces, cities, and towns, to close schools in an effort to contain the outbreak's spread. Hundreds of millions of students around the globe are now out of school in China, South Korea, Iran, Italy, Japan, France, Pakistan, and elsewhere. Ruby Tan, a primary school teacher in Chongqing, a city in southwestern China, that suspended schools last month, said many grandparents were helping with childcare so that parents can go to work. School administrators in Japan, caught off guard by the abrupt decision to close schools, have rushed to cancel orders for cafeteria lunches, stranding food suppliers with piles of unwanted groceries and temporary, unneeded employees. Biden's delegate lead is small, but could be hard to overcome. The state's Democratic electorate is a mix of African American and more conservative and affluent white voters who tend to back Mr. Biden, and younger, urban, and Latino voters who tend to back Mr. Sanders. In a telling indication of how quickly moderate voters had coalesced behind Mr. Biden, the exit polls across the Super Tuesday states found that among voters who decided in just the last few days, Mr. Biden won by a margin of 48% to 21%. Mr. Sanders denied Mr. Biden a sweep because of the West, where Mr. Sanders can count on his strengths among Latinos, liberals, and younger urban voters without fully facing his weakness among African American voters and conservative rural whites. Why did Biden suddenly sweep Virginia? Credit Trump, these voters say. Overall, 1.3 million voters in Virginia went to the polls on Tuesday, surpassing the votes cast in 2016 by nearly 70%. And even more stunningly breaking a previous Democratic record of 986,000 set in 2008 when Barack Obama was on the ballot. The Falls Church precinct that voted at Shrevwood Elementary School steps from a popular cycling trail that some commuters use to get to work in the capital, drew nearly twice as many voters on Tuesday as it did for the 2016 contest between Mr. Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Ms. Clinton's margin over Mr. Sanders in 2016 in the precinct was 99 votes. Mr. Biden beat Mr. Sanders by 250 votes. We spoke to 6 Americans with coronavirus. Not until their wives were evacuated to a 14-day quarantine at a California military base where they remained hospitalized in Japan did Mr. Herring and Mr. Grizzle actually lay plans to take their families on another vacation together. We want to sit in beautiful, undiseased waters of the Caribbean, Mr. Herring said during a joint interview with Mr. Grizzle over WhatsApp. Have you ever had a nose swab? He texted Mr. Grizzle on February 21st. Mr. Grizzle, whose low-grade fever was lingering, had not. Jewish cemeteries are threatened. These people are guarding them. The defacing in December of gravestones in cemetery in Westhofen, a sleepy village in Alsace, was not isolated. Officials organizing the Guardians of Memory and the volunteers themselves don't want people to think that in Alsace there is only that, meaning the cemetery attacks, said Philip Ichter, a regional official who helped organize the effort. At the Jewish cemetery near Grusenheim, a lonely spot amid the vegetable fields at the edge of town, Sylvian Sutter, a farmer, had already taken care of the cemetery before the Guardians of Memory initiative started, having been recruited years earlier by a merchant with relatives buried there. Taliban ramp up attacks on Afghans after Trump says no violence. The Taliban have resumed attacks against Afghan forces soon after signing a deal to end their war with the U.S. military, raising concerns that the Americans are leaving their Afghan allies vulnerable to an insurgency unwilling to let go of violence as its main leverage. A senior Afghan security official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said Afghan forces still had not resumed their offensive special operations, but were remaining on active defense, only targeting Taliban units that were advancing on their outposts. In the same period, Afghan forces killed about 20 Taliban fighters a day in fending off their attacks, a senior Afghan official said. Israel's right had a good election, so did Israeli Arabs. That may be no coincidence. The increasingly hardline policies on Israel's main centrist opposition party, Blue and White, may also have drawn a few Jewish voters to the joint list, as well as stirring the Arab electorate. The joint list wins may give Arab lawmakers a greater role on the national stage. Mr. Gantz cannot form a coalition to topple Mr. Netanyahu without the Arab alliance. To deter Mr. Gantz from trying to work with the joint list, Mr. Netanyahu argued on Wednesday that any coalition featuring the Arab grouping would lack a legitimacy. Deadlocked after 3 elections, Israel seeks ways to avert a 4th. After 3 brutal campaigns, 3 elections, and 3 failed attempts at forming a government, Israel now finds itself right back to where it was over a year ago, deadlocked over the fate of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu could wound turncoats from the other side, given the presence of right-leaning politicians in the broad coalition headed by Benny Gantz, the former army chief at the helm of the Blue and White Party. There is a better chance that Netanyahu will topple Hamas's rule than that someone from Blue and White will defect, he said, alluding to the Islamist militant movement that controls Gaza, showing they still have some fight in them. Lawmakers from all 3 center-left parties spoke in favor of passing a law to bar Israel's president from giving the task of forming a government to a lawmaker under indictment. Climate change affected Australia's wildfires. Scientists confirm. Confirming what has been widely suspected, researchers have found that human-caused climate change has an impact on Australia's recent devastating wildfires, making the extremely high-risk conditions that led to widespread burning at least 30% more likely than in a world without a global warming. The researchers said the full influence of climate change on the fires was probably much greater, but that the climate simulations, which form the basis of this type of study, underestimate trends in extreme heat. In Australia, compared with real-world observational data, the research is the latest in a growing subfield of climate science, attribution studies that looks for links, or lack of them, between climate change and specific weather-related events, often within weeks of an event. A balancing act for Europe. Stop the migrants, support Greece, assuage Turkey. The European Union still has nightmares about the mismanaged chaos of the 2015 influx of migrants and refugees, which produced horrible pictures of dead children, masses of unregistered people wandering the roads, political divisions, and a significant boost to the far-right populism across the continent. European officials point out that the border between Idlib and Turkey is tightly shut, and that so far there's no new influx of Syrian refugees. In a sense, Mr. Niblitz said there's a beginning of a more realist European foreign policy, which will continue to pay off Mr. Erdogan to avoid a new wave of refugees. Italy's elderly suffer heavy toll as coronavirus spreads. A table of old men were shooting the breeze next to the bocce ball court in Milan, a recreation center, on a Wednesday, talking like seemingly everyone else in northern Italy about the coronavirus outbreak that shut down the towns, closed all of Italy's schools, and claimed the lives of more than 100 people, almost all of them the elderly. Even as Italy locks down towns, 2 men were added on Wednesday, bringing the total to 13. The virus continued to spread. Italy's measures have slowed the outbreak, but not enough to allay concerns about the burden it's placing on the healthcare system and the threat it poses, especially to older people. The measure introduced in these days aimed to avoid a large epidemic wave, Italy's National Health Institute said in a statement, explaining its stiffening guidelines, which recommend personal separation as schools close nationwide until at least March 15th. In the case of coronavirus, you must take into account that Italy has an elderly population, actually much older than the Chinese, and needs to be protected from contagion. Why the coronavirus isn't what this Canadian in Hong Kong fears the most. The streets of the city, usually teeming with people, are practically empty, and no one knows when Hong Kong might recover from the coronavirus outbreak that has crippled the economy and devastated tourism. There are approximately 650,000 foreign residents in Hong Kong, a city of over 7 million people. People are hedging their bets on Hong Kong recovering from the virus, she said. Coronavirus and your dog. No need to panic. Yet, Hong Kong authorities on Wednesday updated the reports on the lone dog that appears to have a low-grade infection from coronavirus, saying it's likely a case of human transmitting it to the dog. A coronavirus patient in Hong Kong had the dog, and the authorities tested the dog, which showed some level of virus in its nose and mouth. Even if there is a low-level infection, he said that doesn't say the animal is sufficiently infected that it can spread the virus. It may be a dead-end host, neither becoming ill nor infecting any other people nor animals. House passes $8.3 billion emergency coronavirus response bill. Ahead of the crown of Congress approving the emergency funds, the agency said it would transfer $25 million of those funds to states and cities that have already spent substantial resources on the response to the virus. The measure would provide $6.5 billion for the department, with $2.2 billion designated specifically for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, $3.1 billion for the Public Health and Social Services Emergency Fund, and $836 million for the National Institutes of Health. The funds allocated for the CDC would include $1 billion for state and local preparedness and response, with half of those funds going to states, cities, and tribes within 30 days, according to a summary provided by the Senate Appropriation Committee. Criticized for coronavirus response, Trump points to Obama administration. The Obama administration made a decision on testing that turned out to be very detrimental to what we're doing, and we undid that decision a few days ago so that the testing can take place in a much more accurate and rapid fashion, Mr. Trump said. Local health agencies have complained that a lack of coronavirus testing has hindered their abilities to identify patients, and tight restrictions imposed by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention on who could be tested have meant that some infected patients waited days before diagnoses. Michelle Foreman, a spokeswoman for the Association of Public Health Laboratories, whose members have complained that the Food and Drug Administration took too long to approve their tests, said there was some discussion during the Obama administration about whether to tighten restrictions on laboratories that developed their own tests, but nothing was ever put in place. Told to stay home, suspected coronavirus patients attended event with Dartmouth students. In the New Hampshire case, the man went to the doctor on a Friday with a fever and respiratory symptoms and was tested for a range of possibly ailments, health authorities said. According to a message on the club's Facebook page, owners received a call from Dr. Benjamin Chan, an epidemiologist with the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services, informing them that an individual who tested positive for coronavirus has attended the event on Friday night. It is not illegal to ignore the advice of your healthcare provider or even the health department until officials follow the particular procedures to issue a formal health order, and those procedures vary by state. California reports first coronavirus death as symptoms swirl on cruise ship. Officials in Los Angeles County, with 10 million residents, the largest county in the nation, declared a state of emergency, warning that the number of confirmed cases was likely to rise. Dr. Jonathan Fielding, a public health expert at the University of California, Los Angeles, said that the number of cases in California, a large state that is frequent entry point for travel from Asia, was likely to rise, particularly as officials increased their capacity to test and diagnose cases. A previous case in the Los Angeles County has been diagnosed in January, when a person who lived in Wuhan, China, where the coronavirus originated, traveled to Los Angeles County. Nursing homes are starkly vulnerable to coronavirus. In tweaking its existing guidance, the federal government is now telling nursing homes to bar visits by people who are sick and have traveled to affected countries, and offers procedures for determining when nursing homes and hospitals to transfer COVID-19 patients to one another. Since the outbreak at the Life Care Center in Kirkland, Washington, nursing home chains and trade groups, along with mom and pop homes and assisted living operations, have been trying to get policies in place with uncertain information. At St. Anne Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Seattle, a 47-bed skilled nursing home, signs went up in January discouraging visits from relatives or friends with symptoms of flu or colds, but concern had gone into overdrive after a nearby Kirkland outbreak, said Marita Smith, the home's administrator. Why Washington State? How did it start? Questions answered on the U.S. coronavirus outbreak. After the county released its recommendations, Microsoft, one of the region's largest employers, told employees in Puget Sound and the San Francisco Bay Area to work from home until at least March 25th. With Washington State the focal point of the virus in the United States, some of the measures unveiled here may presage what is to come in other parts of the country. There are three main explanations for why more cases of the coronavirus may have been detected in Washington State than any other state in the nation. More samples from the state are being analyzed by the CDC. Seeing as how they all relate to each other will be the real answer to the question of, has it been circulated? Said Dr. Scott Lindquist, the state epidemiologist for communicable diseases with the Washington State Department of Health. A slap in the face. Chinese readers share their coronavirus stories. The New York Times asked Chinese readers all over the world to share their views on how the country responded to the coronavirus outbreak, which originated in Hubei province in central China. The top leadership of China bears direct responsibility for losing control over the outbreak. The last time I'd been back to China was last August, and my hometown was not an epicenter of the outbreak. Coronavirus enters the campaign bloodstream. Now, with the tables turned and the Republican president in the White House, Democrats are working to use the administration's response to the novel coronavirus to amplify their own campaign messages. And Republicans are quick to charge that they are improperly politicizing the outbreak. While the White House was under siege in October 2014, the Ebola issue was bubbling up in congressional races around the country, with Republicans linking it to a need for tighter border security and claiming it illustrated Obama administration incompetence. Democrats in turn accused Republicans and House members running for the Senate, such as Mr. Cotton and Cory Gardner of Colorado, of having voted to cut crisis response funding in the past. What's it like to come home to the stigma of coronavirus? In the days that followed, 1,580 crew members and passengers tested negative, including Mr. King. After the Westerdam was allowed to dock in Cambodia, Mr. King, a stand-up comedian who performed on the ship, arranged his own travel home. "People are giving my wife a hard time, asking, is he sorry now?" said Mr. King, who initially declined an interview, but eventually told his story. 9 new cases of coronavirus in New York, all connected to Westchester man. The son of a Westchester County man, whose officials announced had New York's second case of the new coronavirus, also tested positive for the virus, said officials at his university on Wednesday. The son's illness is the third confirmed case of coronavirus in New York State that has been announced. On Tuesday, officials announced that the student's father, a man of about 50 who lives in Westchester, had the illness. After family gets coronavirus, New York suburb is gripped by anxiety. Shortly before dusk on Tuesday, Nathan Lindenbaum, an accountant, had walked up the temple doors of Young Israel of New Rochelle for evening prayers. The same day as the man's diagnosis on Tuesday, Josh Berkowitz, the owner of Eden Walk in New Rochelle, hired a public relations specialist and started offering 50% off coupons to stem an anticipated drop in diners. Ken Barrett, who works for an online food delivery service, arrived at the restaurant to fulfill his orders, unaware of the situation in New Rochelle. An undiplomatic diplomat wins power in Trump's Washington. In 2017, the president nominated him to be ambassador to Germany, a perch that Mr. Grinnell has used to spread his brand of combative conservatism and emerge as an outspoken Trump loyalist. With President Barack Obama's election in 2008, Mr. Grinnell, working his Republican connections, applied for a public relations job at Deutsche Asset Management in New York. Mr. Grinnell's interviews went poorly, two people familiar with the process said. Elliot S. Burke, a lawyer retained by Mr. Grinnell, said in a statement that Mr. Grinnell spoke out about Moldovan affairs, strictly on his own and not on behalf of anyone else, including any of his clients. Mr. Grinnell was not aware of the identity of Mr. Finkelstein's clients, Mr. Burke said, adding that Mr. Grinnell gave Mr. Finkelstein media and strategic advice and made introductions to United Nations diplomats and officials. Translator accused of revealing U.S. secrets amid tensions with Iran. For 6 weeks, she accessed secret government files that contain the true names and photographs of American intelligence sources and government cables that outline the information they provided to their handlers. According to government documents, Ms. Thompson had a romantic interest in the Lebanese man with whom she shared the classified secrets, and his nephew is a government official in Lebanon. A little over a year ago, the government charged the former Air Force counterintelligence agent Monica Elfried Witt with sharing secrets of the government of Iran, including the names of agents run by military intelligence, whose cover was blown, and the identities of her former co-workers. Justices give few hints on how they will rule on Louisiana abortion law. The meaning of Chief Justice Roberts' vote to temporarily block the Louisiana law is unclear, and it is hardly certain that he will vote to uphold the law now that it is before the court on its merits. The Louisiana law was struck down in 2017 by Judge John W. DeGravelle of the Federal District Court in Baton Rouge, who said the doctors willing to perform abortions were often unable to obtain admitting privileges for reasons unrelated to their competence, and the law created an undue burden on abortion's rights. In dissent, Justice Stephen A. Higginson wrote that Louisiana law was equivalent to structure, purpose, and effect to the Texas law, invalidated by Supreme Court in 2016. I'm unconvinced that any justice of the Supreme Court who decided whole women's health would endorse our opinion, Judge Higginson wrote. Court bans agent who botched Carter Page surveillance from seeking wiretaps. After the Inspector General report was released in early December, detailing a dysfunctional effort by investigators to seek court permission to surveil Mr. Page, whom they had suspected of being a link between Trump campaign and the Russian government, the FBI said it would take corrective steps. The Inspector General, Michael E. Horowitz, found that 4 applications to wiretap Mr. Page, starting in October 2016 and extending through the summer of 2017, gave the court an incomplete and inaccurate picture of the evidence, including facts that undercut the FBI's belief he might be a Russian agent. Judge Boasberg's new order also directed that no Justice Department or FBI official under disciplinary or criminal review relating to the work on FISA applicants shall participate in drafting, verifying, reviewing, or submitting such applications to the court. A tornado decimated North Nashville. The rebuilding may destroy its soul. Rescue teams, police, and volunteers continued to search for at least 18 missing people in Tennessee on Wednesday, a day after a series of tornadoes tore across the state, killing 24 people. Hours later, a county spokesman said the number of people missing in Putnam had gone down to 11. Then more names were added, bringing the total to 18. Deaths were reported in Wilson and Benton counties, but officials said there were no reports of missing people in Putnam County, east of Nashville. Rescue workers had fielded calls late into the night as people reported that their friends and relatives were safe, Mr. Porter said. EPA updates plan to limit science used in environmental rules. Under the new version of the plan, the EPA, when writing or revising environmental regulations, would have to give greater weight to research in which the underlying data are available to be retested. Rather than responding to the critics, the EPA appeared to be widening the scope of the plan by allowing its limits on research to be applied retroactively to reverse existing air and water regulations. Stanley Young, a Heartland Institute advisor whose research has questioned the links between particulate matter pollution and premature death, called the latest EPA plan a reasonable compromise and said regulations themselves could harm public health by straining the economy. John Roberts condemns Schumer for saying justices will pay the price for awful decisions. Chief Justice John G. Roberts, Jr., who only very rarely responds to criticism of federal judges, issued a statement on Wednesday denouncing remarks made by Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the Democratic leader, at a rally outside the Supreme Court. Mr. Schumer, speaking while the court heard arguments in a major abortion case, attacked President Trump's 2 Supreme Court appointees, Justices Neil M. Gorsuch and Brett M. Kavanaugh. Justices know that criticism comes with the territory, but threatening statements of this sort from the highest levels of government are not only inappropriate, they are dangerous, he said in a statement. The coronavirus, the stock market. Now Biden's comeback adds to Trump's bad week. Despite Mr. Trump's concerted effort to paint Joseph R. Biden as corrupt, an attempt that led directly to his own impeachment, the former vice president pulled off one of the most remarkable political comebacks in recent history on Tuesday night, re-emerging as the front-runner of the Democratic presidential nomination and Mr. Trump's opponent in November. A sign of Mr. Trump's frustration was evident in one of his early morning tweets on Wednesday, a screed against Jeff Sessions, a former attorney general, who was forced into a runoff Tuesday night for his old Senate seat, Alabama, and whom Mr. Trump still blames for the 2-year probe into possible conspiracy between the president's 2016 campaign and Russian officials. The revival of Mr. Biden, who is buoyed by black voters, a core Democratic Party constituency in several states, illustrates the limit of Mr. Trump's influence. Steve Bullock is poised to run for Senate in Montana, officials say. Governor Steve Bullock of Montana is poised to reverse himself and run for Senate, according to 3 Democratic officials, a decision that would hand the party a coveted recruit who can help reclaim a majority in the chamber. Mr. Bullock, who was Montana's Attorney General before being elected twice as governor, ran for president last year, calling for an overhaul to the country's campaign finance laws and urging Democrats to pay more attention to rural areas and the West. But after running as a defender of gun rights in his earlier campaigns, Mr. Bullock said during his White House bid he supported banning the sale of assault weapons, limiting the sizes of ammunition magazines, and enforcing a waiting period to purchase firearms that provided a sufficient time for a full background check of the purchaser, as he put it in a New York Times survey. Mr. Trump is likely to carry Montana in the presidential election, just as he did in 2016, but Mr. Bullock could prove a formidable contender in the Senate race. Trump's economic cheerleading is suddenly tested. One of President Trump's greatest strengths is his presidential campaign is his economic salesmanship. He's convinced a devoted share of Americans as leadership has made the U.S. economy bulletproof and that markets would crash if he were defeated in November. More than 8 of 10 Republican voters who regularly follow Mr. Trump's speeches say Mr. Trump deserves a lot of credit for the economy. In a presentation earlier this year in which he compared Trump's economic message to the spread of a pandemic virus, Mr. Schiller reported that 62% of newspaper articles that mentioned a strong economy from 2017 to 2019 also mentioned Mr. Trump. Latinos and young people come through for Sanders in California. With Mr. Sanders receiving more than 70% of the Latino vote under the age of 30, about a half of Latino voters overall, according to an exit poll, his lead over the other candidates looks decisive way. The Associated Press projected Mr. Sanders as the winner of the state just minutes after the polls closed, where thousands of voters in Los Angeles were still in line to cast their ballots because of problems with voting machines. Mr. Sanders won more white and Asian American voters, I say. But reflecting a national trend, Mr. Biden took the lead among black voters, according to the pinche exit polls. With black voters and a suburban surge, Joe Biden takes Texas. Texas was not a state that played to former Vice President Joseph R. Biden's strengths, especially for a campaign that 4 days ago, before the Texas primary and without significant win, looked positively weak. The magnitude of the support for Mr. Biden from rivals he had previously feuded with on the debate stage put his Dallas rally, where Ms. Klobuchar and Mr. O'Rourke appeared live on national cable news and nearly every Texas news station, offering Texas voters a look at sudden surge in support for the vice president. Texas Democrats are generally pragmatic problem solvers and not dogmatic ideologues, said Gary Marrow, a former Texas land commissioner who ran for governor in 1998 and who was a chairman of Hillary Clinton's campaign in Texas in the 2016 election. Wall Street, encouraged by Biden's win, breaks out its checkbooks. Joseph R. Biden, the former vice president and a moderate candidate with a solid support on Wall Street, has notched an unexpectedly strong showing in the Super Tuesday primaries. Of course, Mr. Sanders could still win the nomination, but for Mr. Novogratz and others on Wall Street, Mr. Biden's resurgence offered the opportunity to bankroll a Democrat they can get behind. Tracy V. Maitland, the president of Advent Capital Management and a supporter of Mr. Biden's, said he was fielding numerous calls and texts from elated friends on Wall Street and in the entertainment industry. 5 takeaways from a Super Tuesday that changed the Democratic race. Mr. Biden won big across the South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, and made a surprise incursion in the Northeast, beating Senator Elizabeth Warren on her turf in Massachusetts, and even wresting some delegates from Mr. Sanders in his home state of Vermont, where 4 years ago Mr. Sanders pulled off a clean sweep. One of the biggest fissures in the upcoming battles between Mr. Biden and Mr. Sanders will be generational. Mr. Biden wins older voters by a lot, and Mr. Sanders wins younger voters by a lot. They're going to fight fiercely for everyone in between. In Vermont, Mr. Biden nearly matched Mr. Sanders among those aged 65 or older, while nearly 7 in 10 voters under 40 went with Mr. Sanders. How huge voter turnout eluded Bernie Sanders on Super Tuesday. After losing most Super Tuesday states to Joseph R. Biden Senator Bernie Sanders delivered a striking assessment of his campaign, acknowledging that he was disappointed with the results and that his crucial campaign message of inspiring young people to vote was falling short. Because so few young people voted, it did not matter that Mr. Sanders won them by huge margins, because Mr. Biden won the much more plentiful older voters, while Mr. Sanders had succeeded in galvanizing Latino voters, who won them by 27 percentage points over Mr. Biden in California. He has struggled to build support among black voters. After mounting losses, Elizabeth Warren reviews her options. Mr. Sanders, speaking to supporters in Vermont on Wednesday afternoon about his own disappointment with Super Tuesday results, said he had spoken with Miss several hours earlier by phone, and she had told him she was assessing her campaign, but had not made any decisions yet. Now Super Tuesday has come and gone, and Miss was the only one of four leading candidates not to score an outright victory, even in Massachusetts, where she fell behind Mr. Biden, who won, and Mr. Sanders. Left-wing advocacy groups had endorsed Mr. Sanders, but were previously wary of criticizing Miss made clear on Tuesday evening they believe the primary had become a choice between two candidates, Mr. Biden and Mr. Sanders, not Miss Elizabeth had a good run. Maybe next time, ladies. More subtly, ambitious women are viewed more negatively than men, while women leaders are often considered less legitimate than men, in the United States, at least. So there are a lot of women who might not vote for a woman because they're worried that other voters won't vote for her, but if everyone just voted for who they actually wanted to be president, the woman would win. With multiple women in the running, perhaps the discussion could move past the tired trope that says, of course, I'd support a woman for president, just not that woman. Why Biden is the change candidate. Increasingly, there's a sense that, in practice, the real change candidate may be Joe Biden, because he has a better chance of winning the presidency and helping to elect a Democratic Congress. That's why he's a big winner on Super Tuesday. Angry Bernie voters may protest furiously that it was the establishment that revived Biden to seize a prize that seemed theirs. Trump's tweets suggested that he was terrified of Biden and Mike Bloomberg, and it's no accident that Republicans were calling for investigations into Biden's family rather than into allegations about the Sanders family and Burlington College. The presidency is an old boys club. Bernie Sanders, 78. Joe Biden, 77. Both born during World War II. Is that a problem? I've always had a theory. As people get older, if they're lucky, they get better and better at a more limited set of skills. Trump's already making a big deal about Biden's tendency to garble his words when he's talking in public. The president called Biden Sleepy Joe, which maybe is an age-related insult. How to survive a quarantine. Their plans are upended, the future is uncertain, and for most of us, no matter how rational we think about risk, no matter how calm we imagine we will be in a crisis, there's a recipe for freaking out. The American officials did not know how that would be handled, but we were asked to cooperate, and we did. Could we leave our room? So would we get into trouble if they found us all here together? What if I got sick? What if the children got sick? Will they be taken away from me? How long until we can go home? Huh? Ah! Anatomy of a Parisian sex scandal. Are the French becoming like Americans who punish public officials for private sins? How did the attention-seeking Russian artist who released the tape manage to disrupt a French election? Who's the alluring 29-year-old woman at the center of the scandal, who seems to have bedded both the Russian and Mr. Griveaux? Most French voters don't actually think that meant Mr. Griveaux was a strict monogamist, nor were they outraged to discover he wasn't. According to French news reports, in May 2018, a 20-something graduate student, Alexandre de Tatel, began leaving political comments and book suggestions on Instagram for Mr. Griveaux, then spokesman for Mr. Macron's government. Joe Biden's stunning Super Tuesday comeback. Fuck. One moment, technical difficulty. We know Joe, but more importantly, Joe knows us. With those 9 words, Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina kicked off an incredible week for Joe Biden for the Democratic Party. There are psychological explanations for Joe Biden's strength in the Super Tuesday voting. The public should demand that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have complete physical and psychological workups and that the full results be released. They wanted an apartment. Then the broker asked for a $2,850 fee. One listing in Brooklyn advertised no broker fee, but said the application fee was $800. A disclosure suddenly appeared at the bottom of listings on StreetEasy and Craigslist. This broker represents a tenant, meaning a broker who could still collect a fee, which can be up to 15% of the annual rent. A tenant safely in a new home can go after negligent brokers and landlords in court to try to enforce the laws. Catherine S., who spoke on the condition of not using her last name, said she tried to rent an apartment she found on Zillow and asked for the broker on the listing whether the landlord would be paying the broker fee. Harvey Weinstein adds prison consultant to his entourage. In the last few weeks, Mr. Rothfeld has worked with Mr. Weinstein's lawyers to make sure that city jail officials give the producer medical attention while he is being detained before sentencing, now set for March 11th. Over the weekend, photographs emerged online of Mr. Weinstein sitting in what seemed to be a common room at Bellevue, watching television in an armchair with the wheelchair parked beside him. Mr. Rothfeld said he was working with Mr. Weinstein's lawyers on the sentencing memo designed to persuade Justice Burke to recommend sending the producer to a prison with a medical or protective custody unit so that he could be housed apart from the general population. As part of his contract, Mr. Rothfield said he had counseled not only the producer but members of his family too, advising them on how to visit Mr. Weinstein once he enters prison, how to send him packages, and how to contact him by phone. A Bowery chapel once let homeless New Yorkers sleep inside. No more! The Code Blue policy change at the mission, coming against the backdrop of gentrification, has prompted questions about how the mission sees its role at a time when a record number of people in New York City are homeless. During the nearly 5 years of Mr. Jones' leadership, the mission doubled the number of people enrolled each year in its residential recovery programs, absorbing the Goodwill Rescue Mission in Newark, New Jersey, and the New York City Rescue Mission in Tribeca. Guests in need of Cold Blue shelter will be referred to partnering agencies and shelters, she wrote, adding that the mission would provide overnight warming centers where when subway and bus services is suspended because of extreme weather or when travel is too hazardous. Water main break disrupts L train with Brooklyn-Manhattan service briefly shut. A water main break caused a major disruption on the L train subway line on Wednesday, forcing transit officials to shut services between Brookline and Manhattan and upending the morning commute for thousands of people. The water main break occurred near the Bedford station on the L train in Brooklyn, officials said. As a result, transit officials suspended service between the 14th Street Union Square station in Manhattan and the Myrtle Avenue stations in Brooklyn. With oil prices down 20%, OPEC pushes for stability. On Wednesday, Russia, which has cooperated with OPEC for the last 3 years, balked at making more cuts at its preliminary meeting, Reuters reported, sending oil prices for Brent crude down by more than 1% to 51.26 a barrel. Even without a formal cut by OPEC and Russia, exports have already plummeted from Venezuela, Libya, and Iran without supporting oil prices. Amrita Sen, a chief oil analyst at Energy Aspects, a market research firm, said OPEC was preparing to cut a cut of 1 million barrels or more. DoorDash faces its latest challenge, wooing Wall Street. DoorDash said last week that it had confidently filed to go public, setting itself up as a test for whether highly valued money-losing startups can make it into the stock market at a time when Wall Street is deeply skeptical of such companies and the coronavirus outbreak has caused market turbulence. To compete with other companies offering takeout, DoorDash has expanded its selection of restaurants it delivered from by adding ones it had not signed up to be a part of listings. Grubhub has adopted DoorDash's strategy of adding restaurants to its listings without their permission, though Matt Maloney, Grubhub's chief executive, said in October the company believed it was the wrong long-term answer. Airlines feel deepening impact as coronavirus upends trend. In a letter to employees, the airline's two top leaders announced plans to cut international service in April by about 20% and domestic service by about 10%, with similar cuts possibly in May. They also announced a hiring freeze through June and said workers in the United States could apply for voluntary unpaid leave. Thomas J. Donahue, chief executive of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, said at a news conference on Wednesday that the airline industry didn't need bailouts, though he said that if regional airlines encounter difficulties, we'll figure out a way to bring assets together and keep them flying. Since January, airlines have reduced or canceled services to Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, Italy, and other destinations as demand for travel abroad slid. Star engineer who crossed Google is ordered to pay $179 million to the company. Anthony Lewandowski, a former Google and Uber engineer who helped pioneer self-driving cars, filed for bankruptcy protection on Wednesday after a court ordered him to pay $179 million to Google over a contract dispute. The engineer had for years worked on self-driving cars for Google before leaving to create an autonomous vehicle startup in 2016 and later joining the ride-hailing giant Uber. An arbitration panel had ruled in December that Mr. Lewandowski and another colleague, Lior Ron, had engaged in unfair and deceptive practices by secretly poaching away Google colleagues to join the startup. In 2017, Waymo, a newly christened self-driving company spun out of Google, sued Uber and Mr. Lewandowski for theft of trade secrets, accusing the two of conspiring to steal years of autonomous vehicle research to bolster Uber's own self-driving program. Tulsi Gabbard's $50 million suit against Google is dismissed. A federal judge on Wednesday dismissed $50 million lawsuit filed by Representative Tulsi Gabbard, a Democrat presidential candidate, that accused Google of infringing on her free speech when it briefly suspended her advertising account last year. The judge, Stephen V. Wilson, of the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California, granted Google's motion to dismiss the lawsuit because the Gabbard campaign had failed to prove that the First Amendment clause that prohibits the government from curbing free speech applied to Google as a private company. The Gabbard campaign's lawsuit failed to establish how Google's regulations of its own platform is in any way equivalent to a government regulation of an election, Judge Wilson wrote in his order. NBC plans for Tokyo Olympics as coronavirus worries advertisers. If NBC Universal is anxious about how coronavirus may affect its plan for the Olympic Games, it is trying not to show it. So there should be no losses should there not be an Olympics. There wouldn't be a profit this year, but again, we're optimistic. The Olympics are going to happen. The games didn't happen without corporate support. The games don't happen without corporate support. He added that companies with money in the Olympics were hoping and praying they went on as scheduled. Simon & Schuster is up for sale. A sale of Simon & Schuster, one of the 5 largest book publishers in the country, would shake up the publishing industry, which has become a winner-take-all business dominated by huge companies and brand-name authors. Founded as a publisher of crossword puzzle books in 1924 by Richard L. Simon and M. Lincoln Schuster, Simon & Schuster expanded into a major house with 50 imprints, including Charles Scribner's Sons, the publisher of 20th century heavyweights like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Thomas Wolfe. Whatever the outcome, this process does not change what we know to be true at Simon Schuster. We're a great publishing house and one of the world's best known publishing brands, and with incredible legacy and a bright future. Wells Fargo was promised soft handling by Trump appointee, Democrats say. Mr. Blankenstein, an enforcement official at the agency, privately offered reassurances to Wells Fargo's chief executive at a time that there would be political oversight of its enforcement actions, according to a report issued Wednesday by the House Financial Services Committee. The report said the agency had promised that the unresolved regulatory matters, such as an inquiry into the bank's aggressive practices of closing customers' accounts, would be settled in private without further fines. According to the report, Mr. Scharf's immediate predecessor, C. Alan Parker, explicitly told a member of the bank's board in May that Mr. Blankenstein had promised him that the Trump administration would continue to smooth the way for the bank even after Mr. Blankenstein resigned that week over racist statements he had made as a law student. GM lays out ambitions for electric vehicle lineup to rival Tesla. General Motors on Wednesday laid out a comprehensive plan to produce affordable electric vehicles, including several new models expected to arrive in the next 2 years. Tesla has dominated sales of electric cars so far in the United States and abroad, but GM is betting it can catch and possibly surpass its rivals by lowering costs and attracting mainstream buyers. GM's push is underpinned by a newly developed set of batteries, electric motors, electronics, and vehicle architectures that can be used for any type of model, from a compact car to a full-size pickup truck, company executives said. Get the most out of your fancy smartphones and cameras. To quickly jump between the cameras in photo mode, tap the screen and select the 0.5 or 1 or 2 times buttons. On the iPhone 11 line, the night mode activates when the camera app is open in low light and on the standard one-time zoom setting. To adjust background blur on a portrait in your camera roll, open the image, tap the depth control button at the top of the screen, and adjust the sliders that appear below. U.S.-backed candidate for Global Tech Post beats China's nominee. An American-backed candidate on Wednesday beat out China's nominee to lead the United Nations organization charged with protecting intellectual property, a vote that followed weeks of vicious diplomatic sniping between Washington and Beijing. Darren Tang of Singapore easily won the nomination to take over as the Director General of the Geneva-based World Intellectual Property Organization, collecting 55 of the votes cast by 83 members of the state to 28 for China's candidate, Wang Binyan. The potential for China to oversee a body responsible for protecting intellectual property, key to the development of next-generation products, prompted a fierce lobbying campaign by the White House and the State Department aimed at persuading other nations to back Mr. Tang. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said last month that Washington was watching the election very, very closely, and the United States will make sure that whoever runs an organization understands the importance of enforcing intellectual property rights across nations and across boundaries. A blue Great Wall divides a city as it battles the coronavirus. Heaping officials called the steel sheets a blue Great Wall, though in fact it's a series of smaller walls across the district. The name is reference to a Great Wall that China's imperial leaders built to ward off northern nomads in another era. The local government said in a statement that the blue Great Wall blocks off-site entrances into communities and lets officials more easily track people moving through main entrances. Sick workers and spooked customers. Coronavirus threatens small business. In the United States, some members of Congress are also considering policies to assist small business leaders and their employees, including federal loans to cover outbreak-related losses and reimbursement for workers who need to take sick leave. Small businesses are on the front lines of the crisis, said Amanda Valentine, executive director of Main Street Alliance, a public policy group for small businesses. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has advised businesses to do things that require sick employees stay at home, establish sick leave policies that do not punish workers, or require a doctor's note, and ask employees to inform them if family members are sick. Stocks surge as Biden leads Super's Tuesday results. European markets open modestly lower. After a choppy day in Asia, here's what you need to know. Global markets stabilized on Wednesday, one day after Wall Street ended sharply lower, signaling a wait-and-see stance by investors over how world leaders would react to worldwide coronavirus outbreak. From Tokyo to New York, investors are grappling with the potential damage the coronavirus could inflict on the global economy as fractured supply chains, travel bans imposed by companies and governments, and the disruption of daily life in general take their toll. Most of the restrictions by American companies are on cross-border travel, but Ford Motor Company told its employees on Tuesday to stop all domestic air travel in the United States as well, and to use video conferences as much as possible for critical meetings. The Fed simplifies capital rules, a change sought by big banks. The Federal Reserve on Wednesday moved to simplify capital rules, a long-expected change that big banks have been pushing for, and one that sharply divided central bank officials. Today's rule gives a green light for large banks to reduce their capital buffers materially, at a time when payouts have already exceeded earnings for several years on average. Ms. Brainard said in a statement released alongside the changes that were announced on Wednesday. The rule will cause an increase as measured through the cycle in common equity capital of about $46 billion at the 8 largest U.S. banks, Mr. Quarles said. And that, my friends, my countrymen, my fellow Americans, and people all over the world, has been reading the Times for Thursday, the year of our Shaz, it's March 5th as well, 2020.